The Operator Log, Episode 12. What we've learned. The Arco Flywheel, how operational intelligence compounds. The competitive advantage of a venture studio is not what it builds, it is what it learns. Last week, we examined engineering for liquidity, why autonomous companies are structurally superior acquisition targets, and how the architectural decisions made at the start of a build determine what the business is worth at exit. The preview at the end of that episode named this week's subject the Arco Flywheel. The competitive advantage of a venture studio is not what it builds. It is what it learns. The Arco Flywheel is the compounding mechanism by which each autonomous business Arco builds generates operational proof, resolved failure patterns, and reusable infrastructure that reduces the cost and time of launching the next business. Each build is not just a company, it is a contribution to a shared operational library. And that library makes each subsequent company more architecturally certain, more quickly profitable, and more valuable at exit than the one that preceded it. Most studios are factory line for separate ideas. Each company starts from zero, absorbs the same infrastructure drag, and rediscovers the same failure modes. The flywheel is the structural alternative. Every problem solved in one build is solved for all subsequent builds. The library accumulates. The advantage compounds. This is the operator log. The conventional defense of the independent studio model, the fund that backs separate founding teams in separate markets with separate stacks, is diversity. Different founders, different markets, different architectures produce a broader portfolio and a wider range of learning. This is a reasonable argument in a world where each company is a standalone experiment in a different domain, where the failure modes are domain-specific, and where no shared infrastructure would help one company learn from another. It is a liability in a world where the primary structural challenge, building agentic systems that operate autonomously at scale, is the same challenge across every market Arco enters. Every autonomous business requires the same foundational architecture. Deterministic workflows designed for agent execution rather than human management. Machine-readable interfaces at every integration point. Continuous regression loops to detect logic decay before it reaches the revenue loop. Stewardship protocols calibrated for the specific failure patterns of the deployment. The T-tier classification applied to every workflow before the build begins. Architectural certainty, the state in which the system runs without human intervention for 72 hours at a time, as the performance target that governs every engineering decision. In the first build, all of this is original work. It is expensive, slow, and uncertain because there is no reference architecture, no previous deployment to inherit from, no resolved failure patterns to apply, no calibrated exception handling to borrow. Every engineering hour is spent either building the agentic core components from scratch or discovering through live operation that the initial design was insufficient. This is the infrastructure drag we named in episode 7, the 12 to 18 months a new autonomous build spends on foundational engineering before the core revenue loop can run. The linear model, one studio, multiple independent companies, solves each of these problems once per company and discards the solution. The second company absorbs the same infrastructure drag as the first. The third company rediscovers the same failure modes. The fifth company encounters the same class of exception at the integration layer that the first company resolved 3 years earlier. The knowledge is not transferable because the architecture is not shared and the resolution is not documented in a form that a different team can inherit. This is a structural inefficiency that is invisible when the studio's primary challenge is finding markets and funding founders. It becomes visible and expensive when the primary challenge is what Arco's primary challenge is: building the same category of architecture in proven markets with the same engineering requirements and expecting each successive build to be faster and cheaper than the last. Without the flywheel, Each successive build is approximately as expensive as the first. With it, the marginal cost of building the next company's foundational architecture falls with every deployment. The flywheel converts a linear cost structure into a declining one. That is the structural advantage independent studios cannot replicate, not because the principle is secret, but because replicating the outcome requires running the builds and running them in the same architectural direction, with the explicit intention of modularizing and sharing what each one learns. Traditional studios start from zero with every build. Arco starts from the accumulated logic of every previous one. The flywheel is not an abstraction. It is a specific, growing library of operational assets across three compounding layers. The first is the technical layer, the most directly measurable. Every resolved failure mode becomes a calibrated parameter available to every subsequent build. When Arco encounters context leakage in a logistics deployment, an agent losing task intent across a 30-step workflow, and resolves it by calibrating the execution divergence threshold at the 15% deviation point, that calibration is not discarded at the end of the deployment. It is documented, validated against the operational data, and added to the agentic core as the starting calibration for the next deployment. When a machine-readable interface template is validated in a compliance workflow, it becomes the schema baseline for the next integration point in a different market. When a continuous regression loop configuration detects logic decay in one context and the ghost trial parameters are refined accordingly, those refinements are the starting point for the continuous regression loop in the next deployment. Each build adds to the library. The library makes each subsequent build less likely to encounter the same failure mode in the same form. The second is the operational layer, stewardship protocols, exception handling patterns, and the edge case library built from the decisions stewards make when the architecture surfaces something outside its defined parameters. The first time a steward encounters a specific class of exception, a client request, that falls between the defined boundaries of two Tier 2 workflows, requiring architectural judgment rather than automated resolution, the resolution is a novel event. By the third time a similar class of exception appears across three different deployments, the resolution pattern is identifiable. By the fifth time, it is a documented operational protocol available to every steward across every deployment. The steward in the fifth business does not need to develop judgment about that class of exception from experience. They inherit it from the operational layer of the library. The third is the market layer, the accumulated understanding of how proven market structures differ between logistics, compliance, and professional services deployments. The human-to-logic ratio patterns that appear in freight brokerage versus back-office compliance versus specialist data processing. The specific Tier 2 exception categories that each market produces. The integration points where end-off friction is most likely to appear, and the schema structures that resolve it most cleanly in each industry context. The market layer is the least visible of the three, but compounds over time in a way that makes market selection and architectural design progressively faster and more precise with each new deployment. The consequence across all three layers is measurable in two distinct ways that are often confused. The first is engineering overhead reduction, the hours and cost required to build the agentic foundation to reach architectural certainty before the core revenue loop can run. As the technical layer of the library grows, more of that foundational work is inherited rather than built, and the cost per deployment falls. Arco projects a 40% year-over-year reduction in engineering overhead as the agentic core matures. That is a projection, not a confirmed result. We have not yet accumulated enough successive builds to validate it empirically, but it reflects the directional consequence of the compounding that is already observable across the builds completed to date. The second is time to market reduction, the total time from the decision to enter a market to the first unit of revenue. This includes market validation, architectural design, build, and deployment, the full horizon from identification to live operation. As the technical, operational, and market layers of the library grow, each element of that horizon compresses. The market validation uses market intelligence accumulated from prior deployments. The architectural design inherits components rather than building them from scratch. The build absorbs less infrastructure drag. The deployment benefits from operational protocols that have been tested in live conditions. Arco's internal target for time to market reduction is a 60% per successive build versus an equivalent independent build, an internal benchmark first stated in episode 7 and now understood in its full mechanism. These are not the same claim expressed differently. Engineering overhead reduction measures a specific cost within the build phase. Time to market reduction measures the total duration from decision to revenue. Both compound. They describe different parts of the same structural advantage, the flywheel, expressing itself simultaneously at the engineering level and at the business level. The most common question about the flywheel is whether it can be replicated by reading the Arco log. A competitor who reads every memo, internalizes every principle, and understands every framework has the full conceptual blueprint for autonomous business design. Does that give them the flywheel? The principle, yes. The library, no. And the library is the moat. The flywheel's value is not in the knowledge that resolved failure patterns should be modularized and shared. That is a principle any studio could adopt tomorrow. The value is in the specific resolved patterns themselves. The exact calibration of the execution divergence threshold that prevents context leakage in a logistics workflow is not a principle. It is a number derived from operational data. The confidence interval below, which the agent's output begins to drift from task intent in that specific class of workflow, tested against real production data from a live deployment. That number does not exist in any document. It exists because Arco ran the deployment, observed the failure, calibrated the response, and documented the result in the agentic core. A competitor who understands the principle of execution divergence thresholds needs to run a deployment to discover what calibration prevents context leakage in their specific market context. The library cannot be inherited through observation. It can only be built through operational experience. And operational experience in agentic system deployment is currently measured in deployments, not in years of existence. The flywheel is a moat because the only way to replicate it is to start building and to start 10 builds ago. The connection to exit value from last week is direct. An acquirer purchasing the first Arco business in a given market category is buying a first-generation autonomous system, novel, clean sheet, and valuable, but carrying the residual uncertainty of a system that has been resolved once. An acquirer purchasing the fifth Arco business in the same market category is buying a system that has inherited the operational intelligence of 4 previous deployments. Every class of failure that appeared in the first 4 deployments is a known quantity in the fifth. The technical layer inherited from the library means the system reached architectural certainty faster. The operational layer means the exception patterns are documented. The market layer means the integration points were designed with knowledge of where end-of friction appears in that market and how it is most efficiently resolved. The fifth business is worth more than the first because the acquirer is not just buying a system. They are buying the accumulated operational intelligence of the library behind it. The coordination tax that makes incumbents structurally vulnerable to Arco's market entry also makes them structurally incapable of building a flywheel. In a human-centric organization, operational knowledge lives in people. The experienced coordinator who knows which carrier to call for a difficult lane, the compliance officer who knows which interpretation of a regulatory rule the client will accept, the account manager who knows the history of a relationship that was never recorded. This knowledge does not modularize. It cannot be encoded in an architecture, inherited by the next deployment, or retained when the person who holds it leaves. The coordination tax compounds precisely because the knowledge it protects is held in heads rather than in systems. Arco's architecture is designed to encode that knowledge from the first decision, to hold it in the agentic core where it is transferable, compounding, and permanent. The consequence is a structural divergence that widens with every successive deployment. An independent studio or incumbent that attempts autonomous business design today starts at the same point Arco started at the first build. The gap between where they start and where Arco starts now is the accumulated library. Every resolved failure pattern, every calibrated exception handling protocol, every validated MRI template, every stewardship protocol refined by operational data. That gap grows with every build Arco completes. It cannot be closed by capital investment, by hiring, or by reading the log. It can only be closed by running the builds, which takes time, which requires deploying in proven markets with the right architecture, and which produces a library only after the investment in operational experience has been made. What is the Arco Flywheel and how does it compound? The Arco Flywheel is the mechanism by which each autonomous business Arco builds generates operational proof, resolved failure patterns, and reusable agentic infrastructure that reduces the cost and time of the next launch. The flywheel compounds across three layers: technical, MRI templates, agent orchestration frameworks, calibrated execution divergence thresholds; operational, stewardship protocols, edge case libraries, exception handling patterns; and market, understanding of human-to-logic ratio patterns and integration failure modes across industries. Arco projects a 40% year-over-year reduction in engineering overhead per new launch as the library matures. This is distinct from the 60% time-to-market reduction target. The former measures the cost of building the agentic foundation. The latter measures total time from decision to first revenue. Both compound. The library cannot be replicated through observation, only through running the builds. Here is the verdict on the flywheel. Every other studio starts each build from the same place, 0. 0 resolved failure patterns, 0 calibrated exception handling, 0 validated integration templates, 0 stewardship protocols refined by operational data. The infrastructure drag of the first build is the infrastructure drag of the 10th. The failure modes encountered in the first deployment are rediscovered in the 9th. The knowledge accumulated is held in people, not in systems, and people move on. Capital is a commodity. Operational intelligence is a moat. Arco starts each build from the frontier of everything every previous build has learned. The gap between those two starting points, between 0 and the accumulated library, widens with every successive deployment. A studio that has built once has no flywheel. A studio that has built 12 times has 12 deployments of compounding structural advantage across the technical, operational, and market layers. The only way a competitor can close that gap is to start building, and to have started 10 builds ago. The flywheel also changes what it means to build an autonomous business well. Building well is not just about the architecture of the current deployment. It is about the quality of the contribution each deployment makes to the library. A failure mode documented with precision is more valuable than a failure mode that was patched and forgotten. A stewardship protocol refined through 3 months of operational data and formally archived is more valuable than one that lived in a steward's head and left with them. Every build is simultaneously a company and a contribution. The quality of the contribution determines how fast the flywheel turns. The full written version of this argument is memo number 12, the Arco Flywheel, on the blog at arcoventure.studio. Every term introduced across this arc is defined precisely in the Arco lexicon, at arcoventure.studio/lexicon. Next week, the machine-readable business, why your next customer will be an agent, and what that means for how autonomous businesses are designed to be discovered, evaluated, and contracted. We are not building companies that use the agentic economy. We are building the operational foundation it runs on. This has been episode 12 of the Operator Log.